Turning back now to the White House, where lawmakers are responding to a series of tweets from the president announcing secret talks between the U.S. and the Taliban have been canceled. The talks were set to take place at Camp David. The president says that he canceled the meeting because of a recent Taliban bombing that killed one U.S. soldier. So breaking all of this down now, we have Face the Nation moderator and senior foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan joining us now from Washington. So Margaret, my first question for you is, we're being told that the decision to cancel these talks, it goes a little bit deeper than what the president tweeted. What do we know?
No, that's exactly right. The president said in that tweet he immediately called off talks following that deadly bombing that killed 12, including one American service person. But we know that the talks actually did continue that very same day, immediately after the bombing, and that it wasn't just this one fatality. Keep in mind, there are about 16 Americans who have died over the course of this past year, many of them at the hands of the Taliban. Negotiations continued throughout that. So what was particular to what happened on Thursday? What I heard yesterday from a senior administration official was that it became apparent when this bombing happened on the eve of the talks that the Taliban negotiators at the table didn't have command and control over the fighters on the ground who carried out this attack. That's key. It was also clear that there was some confusion. The Taliban said publicly they would only come to Camp David if there was a signed agreement. There was no signed agreement, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was on Face the Nation yesterday and told me there was confusion around this specific point, but he did believe the Taliban was ready to show up for the meeting itself. There's also this backdrop of upcoming elections in Afghanistan and pressures here within the Trump administration, disagreement on whether that drawdown in U.S. troops from 14,000 to 8,600, which the president announced at the end of August, needs to happen with a negotiated settlement or whether it can happen without one. And so, as with many points here at the Trump White House, there's disagreement within the president's own team.
So, a lot of people were wondering why the president tweeted this out at all. This is a pretty leaky administration, but no one seemed to know about the plans for the talks at Camp David until he sort of outed himself. What is he gaining? Is it about getting ahead of the narrative so maybe he controls it? It was, the Trump administration that broke off the talks and no one else?
Well, President Trump wants to be able to say two things. One, that he's working on the thing he campaigned on, which is ending U.S. involvement in America's longest war, one that has killed about 2,400 U.S. service people over the past 18 years. So he wants to be able to say he's doing that. He hasn't. The U.S. military presence is higher than what it was under President Obama, and now President Trump is looking at bringing them down to Obama-era levels, that 8,600 number I mentioned. President Trump also likes to show that he is the guy who clinches the deal. So I have to emphasize here, this is one of the most protracted, complicated, nuanced, confusing diplomatic problems. It has bedeviled 3 presidents now. President Bush, President Obama, and President Trump all said they wanted to bring the troops home. They all said they wanted to end the conflict. They all wanted a stable government in Afghanistan that kept extremists at bay, cut off ties with al-Qaeda, something the Taliban still hasn't agreed to do. And none of them have been able to do it. Every single Democrat running for president says they're going to be the one to do it. It is so complicated. And you put on this task one of the top diplomats in the region, America's envoy, Zalmay Khalilzad, with a lot of experience. He was at the final point in this negotiation process, and yet the deal blew up, in part because of all this going so public, with the president saying he wanted this to be his deal. He wanted to be the closer. He wanted to put his stamp on it. And typically with diplomatic negotiations, you don't do that until the deal is truly final. This agreement that was in place and ready to go forward was just between the United States and the Taliban. The Taliban is the insurgent group trying to overthrow the elected government of Afghanistan that we're officially aligned with. So there was no agreement yet to end that conflict at all. And you had our ally in Kabul warning that if the United States goes through with this and doesn't include them, that civil war would break out. So this was such a sensitive, delicate point. And the president putting it on the world stage like this would have made it possibly even harder to actually come to a real agreement.
And then you have this news that members of the Taliban, as we have been discussing, were scheduled to be at Camp David. I think that, you know, we were aware that talks had continued even after the bombing in Kabul. And I think a lot of people were asking questions, how can you keep negotiating with a group that clearly is still conducting, you know, terrorist attacks? But then the news that they were scheduled to be hosted at Camp David, I think, is what gave rise to a lot of criticism from both parties. You spoke to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Face the Nation yesterday about that. Let's just play a little bit of that sound.
Make no mistake, we were very thoughtful. We thought about this a long time. And ultimately, the president made the decision that this was the right place. We know the history of Camp David. It's where peace has been negotiated many, many times. And sadly, you often have to deal with some pretty bad characters to get peace. I'd say to anybody who say you shouldn't negotiate with the Taliban, tell me how else they'd like us to talk to try and get reconciliation in Afghanistan.
So you just sort of let us know, because a lot of people might not be aware of some of the very historic negotiations, peace negotiations that have taken place at Camp David, and why presidents sometimes invite world leaders who are at odds to visit with him at Camp David, what that retreat represents.
Well, a few points. Well, Camp David itself, it's kind of this crown jewel. It is the president's retreat. It is typically where most presidents go to, often for thoughtful summits, things where they want some privacy, some one-on-one time with world leaders. You have the Camp David Accords that brokered peace between Egypt and Israel under the Carter administration. That happened there. You've had a lot of thorny issues chewed on at Camp David, typically between world leaders. You hear some White House road crews behind me here. And that is typically what happens there. The idea of bringing what Secretary of State Pompeo has specifically referred to as terrorists, that's how he referred to the Taliban back in March, bringing them into the United States, bringing them to Camp David was very offensive to many of the Republican allies of the president. Particularly, you saw Liz Cheney, the daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney, who said this was a place that the leaders of this country, including her father, were taken to the night of the 9/11 attacks. There's secure bunkers, there's communications equipment, and that's where they hid when this country was under attack. So she took particular offense to the idea that the Taliban, who gave safe haven to bin Laden to plan these attacks, the Taliban that was pushed out of power by the United States in 2011 when we invaded that country, would be brought there as statesmen, brought there not as terrorists, brought there as equals to the elected government of Afghanistan and to the President of the United States. So that is not just a matter of protocol, it was a matter of principle for many Republicans. They had a real hard time with that. But more broadly, I want to make the point here. There is a lot of support for the idea of a negotiated settlement with the Taliban. It looks bad. It feels wrong to many who fought on that battlefield. But remember, President Obama tried to negotiate with the Taliban. He never got this far, in part because he had a different approach to it, including trying to include the government of Afghanistan. The Trump administration got this far because they were brokering a side deal just between the United States and the Taliban. They'd already allowed them to sit down at a negotiating table as equals. This was deeply offensive to many experienced diplomats. 9 of them who served under Republicans and Democrats came out with a scathing letter last week saying you can't charge ahead without including our elected allies, and you can't do something that basically creates another Vietnam. What was all that blood? What was all that treasure spent for if we're going to walk away and let this government fall into the hands of terrorists, into the hands of the Taliban? And remember, ISIS has safe haven there as well. So the opposition isn't to the idea of talking to the Taliban. It's how this deal was coming together, where it was going to be finalized, and all the thorny details that still haven't been figured out, including what happens to the 14,000 U.S. troops who are still there.
Yeah, exactly. As I understand it, there's a pretty big discrepancy as to just how rapidly, once there is a deal, how rapidly they could be removed from that country. This is not going to end anytime soon. Margaret, thanks a lot for your insight and sort of clarifying things for us.
Good to talk to you.